Welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on for this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm a programming librarian here at Cary. Before we begin, if you're having any technical issues, message me in the chat and I can try to help. For any questions this evening, please use the Q&A button. And this program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation and in partnership with Lexington Living Landscapes, who organized and are hosting tonight's event. This is part of the library's ongoing partnership with the organization. And now I'll turn it over to Sarah Bothwell-Allen from Lexington Living Landscapes.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening and welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Sarah Bothwell-Allen with Lexington Living Landscapes. And before I turn the floor over to our speaker, Aaron, let me say a word about Lexington Living Landscapes for any of you not familiar with us. We are a local volunteer nonprofit initiative launched in 2020 to promote sustainable landscaping practices in town. More native plants, fewer invasive species, fewer chemicals, more trees. We grew out of a collaboration between the town's Sustainable Lexington Committee and 3 nonprofits, the Lexington Field and Garden Club, Lexington Climate Action Network, and Citizens for Lexington Conservation. You can learn more about us, including how to sign up for our newsletter, at our website, www.lexingtonlivinglandscapes.org. Our great thanks to Aaron Anderson of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation for joining us this evening and sharing his wisdom with us. Thank you, as always, to Matt at Cary Memorial Library and all our friends at the library for hosting this evening's program. And we know that many of you have learned about tonight's program through the many great organizations we're privileged to work with around the state. So welcome to you as well. After Aaron's presentation, we'll have a question and answer session moderated by me. So if you have questions, and I hope you will, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. That's for technical problems that Matt will look at. And I will get to as many of them as I can. Let me now introduce our speaker. Aaron Anderson works with the public and Xerces staff to reduce pesticide use in residential landscapes, including promoting alternative pest control measures and pollinator-friendly gardening practices. Prior to joining Xerces in 2022, he researched pollinator conservation in urban landscapes, restored habitat for several endangered butterfly species, and worked in insect biocontrol. Aaron has a PhD from Oregon State University. So Aaron, thank you for joining us this evening, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and Charlie, thank you so much for inviting me to come and do this talk, and I'm really excited to be with you all tonight virtually to talk about mosquito control at home a little bit, and about ticks as well. As Sarah mentioned, I am part of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I mainly work in residential landscapes promoting pesticide reduction and alternative pest control measures, as well as, just general kind of pollinator-friendly gardening practices. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about mosquitoes, ticks, and then the risks that the pesticides that are conventionally used to spray these organisms pose to the other beneficial insects in your yard, and some alternative management practices. And before I go any further, I do want to first acknowledge and thank all of these Xerces Society supporters. Without them, we couldn't do all of the work we do, and their support really is so important. And on that note, I do want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're interested and able, I encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll really join this extraordinary group of people who have shown themselves to be inquisitive and engaged in protecting invertebrates in their habitat. And I apologize, it's a very spring day here in Portland, so the clouds keep going back and forth across my window, which is why I'm going dark and then light again. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, and if this is your first webinar with us, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. Our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it lived in the coastal sand dunes around the San Francisco Bay Area. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and we also do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas, and this slide here has some of those, some images of those representative areas. We have people doing endangered mussel work, which I think is really cool. But perhaps the most helpful work we do is writing these detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And I really encourage you to visit our website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, and other invertebrates. And this library is really decades of work and has fantastic resources, so I encourage you to check it out at xerces.org. There's also some mosquito control documents as well, which I'll touch on more later, and I can also send some links to Sarah to share with all of you, or potentially drop them in the chat at the end. Okay, so here's a little bit of an outline of where we're headed in this talk this evening. So I want to start by talking a little bit about mosquito life history and biology, talk about some concerns with pesticide-intensive control methods, and then talk about what you can do at home to manage mosquitoes. And then talk a little bit about tick biology and control, and then end with just a few slides on grassroots and community change. Okay, so today we're mainly talking about mosquitoes. So there are over 170 species of mosquito in the United States, and there's 200 if you include outlying territories. And for reference, there's about 3,500 species of mosquitoes worldwide. And mosquitoes are actually flies, and many don't actually bite, or they don't feed on humans. The ones that do feed on blood often tend to prefer certain types of hosts, from reptiles to birds to mammals like us. So even out of mosquitoes that do feed on blood, only a subset feed on mammals. And even for that subset that do bite and will feed on humans, blood isn't actually their primary source of food. Instead, adults will drink nectar from flowers for energy or sometimes sap. They're essentially looking for sugary things for quick energy. The immature stage, the larvae, are aquatic, and they feed on microorganisms and algae in the water that they're developing in. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in a few slides. But of course, human blood is part of the diet of those species that do feed on us, but only reproductive females bite. They feed on blood called a blood meal because they need proteins from blood to develop their eggs. So despite the common misconception that mosquitoes are nothing but a nuisance, they actually do play ecological roles. Larval mosquitoes, the immature stage, actually contribute to nutrient cycling in wetland areas. As I mentioned, the larval stage is aquatic, and they live in the water and eat things like microorganisms and algae. And some of them are obviously eaten by predators as they're developing, but the surviving mosquitoes that do fly to land are either eaten by other predators or they die and decompose on land. And in doing this, they contribute to the movement of nutrients from wetlands to upland areas. And they're really tiny and, might not seem like a very substantial thing, but in Alaska, for example, there's an estimated 96 million pounds of mosquitoes that hatch every year. And they're also pollinators. Though they might not pollinate at the level of bees or other types of flies, adult mosquitoes do visit flowers to sip for nectar for energy. And unlike bees, they're not actively collecting pollen. This is why bees are such good pollinators, because they're actually going from flower to flower, collecting pollen grains and moving them. But mosquitoes do get pollen grains stuck to them, and they do pollinate flowers, often as generalists. There was a study in Europe that actually found that mosquito visitation significantly increased seed set in tansy flowers, though I should note that in other types of flowers, they didn't see that increase. But this is just to show that they can do more than just take nectar. And there are actually some flowers that have evolved to have mosquitoes pollinate them. The blunt-leafed orchid, for example, is found in northern parts of the country, including where you all are in the Northeast. And researchers have found that certain mosquitoes are actually preferentially attracted to the blunt-leafed orchid due to certain chemical compounds and its odor, while orchids that don't have that odor don't attract mosquitoes. So all of this to say mosquitoes aren't just itchy annoyances. I'd of course be remiss if I didn't mention that mosquitoes, of course, can be significant vectors of disease that impact both humans and livestock. And the concern is real with a changing climate expanding the range of some mosquito species, along with international travel, potentially spreading new mosquito-borne diseases, creating a growing concern about new diseases establishing in the US. And of course, existing diseases can be worrisome as well. Many of you are likely familiar with some types of encephalitis, West Nile, which arrived in the 1990s and is now found throughout the country. The concern over Zika and even dengue fever, since cases have been found in Texas, Hawaii, Florida, as well as the outlying territories. So I in no way want to minimize the seriousness of these diseases, nor the risk that they can pose to people. But often pesticides are used to treat mosquitoes in a way that's unnecessary, won't help solve any human health concerns, and will actually negatively impact the broader insect community. So this is why we need to be kind of prepared ahead so that we don't let fear drive decisions. And then having a solid mosquito management plan can reduce the potential of contracting mosquito-borne diseases. Finally, I do want to note that many mosquitoes that do bite humans are only nuisances. They can be really aggravating and annoying, but they don't act as vectors for disease. For reference, only about 12 of the 200 species found in the US actually transmit diseases that impact us. Okay, so we've hinted at this a little bit already, but I want to dive in and talk about the mosquito life cycle. Life cycles are really important things to understand when you're determining how to control any type of pest. You need to know the life cycle so that you know how to break the life cycle so that the pest can't thrive or survive. So the adult mosquito, which is what we see flying and biting us, is of course only one stage in that cycle. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water, and they only need a small amount of water, about the size of the amount that's in a bottle cap, actually, to reproduce. And females will typically lay about 100 eggs at a time. An adult female can lay multiple times in their lifespan. And mosquito eggs can actually stick to the edge of a container, and say if the water level goes down, they're able to survive with no water for up to 8 months. So in warmer climates, this actually means that mosquitoes can overwinter as eggs. And once they're in suitable still water, eggs will hatch in as soon as a few days after laying. And then they're larvae, represented, at the image on the bottom of this kind of circle here. And these larvae are aquatic, and they feed on microorganisms in the water, and then eventually develop into pupae in only about 5 days. And then the pupa are the last stage before they become flying adults. And pupation takes only about 2 to 3 days, and then they're adult mosquitoes and they fly off into the world. This means the entire life cycle of a mosquito can take place in as few as 8 to 10 days. And with the number of eggs that they can lay, which is up to 500 for one female, this means that they can reproduce really quickly and really have population explosions. Okay, so now that we have that quick background, let's talk a little bit about mosquito control. We'll touch on the issues with pesticide-intensive management at home, and then more effective, ecologically safe, common sense methods that you can use to prevent mosquito populations from building up in your yards and broader communities. Okay, but first, I want to do a quick detour and talk about pesticides and why we're concerned with them, which is kind of the crux of this talk in many respects. If pesticide risks and regulation issues didn't exist, we wouldn't need to have this talk. So I kind of want to dive into this nitty-gritty for a few slides, just so we kind of have an underpinning on the why associated with pesticide use. So many people use insecticides to kill adult mosquitoes, which are also called adulticides. And insecticides, as I'm sure you're all aware, are pesticides designed to kill insects. And we're, of course, very concerned about them because of that. But we're also concerned about herbicides, which are designed to kill plants, and fungicides, which are designed to kill fungi, as well, because they too can have direct as well as indirect effects on invertebrates. So many of you are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They'll kill the target pest, but also everything else in your yard. And this is very pertinent for later in this talk when we talk a little bit about beneficial insects. Pesticide treatments can kill these organisms, which can then lead to worse pest problems down the road. And modern insecticides are very potent, and newer ones are not necessarily more friendly to bees and are actually more concerning many times. I also do want to note really quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they only treat the symptom, the pest outbreak, not the cause of the outbreak. So it's kind of like taking Advil for a headache when you really need to get new glasses or stop staring at computer screens. So when we think about pesticides, we often think of agricultural areas, but they're commonly used in urban and suburban areas as well. And in fact, more pesticides are actually used per acre in many urban areas than in many agricultural areas. In our communities, pesticides are often used for cosmetic reasons, to maintain manicured landscapes, and of course for pest control. So something that's exciting for me about urban and suburban landscapes, in working in these systems, is that yards can actually function as really high quality pollinator and invertebrate habitat, but they need to be managed correctly. And this includes protecting these areas from pesticides. We don't want to be putting all of this effort into creating great habitat for invertebrates and then risk having them be exposed to toxic pesticides. So diving a little bit more into the weeds, I want to touch on pesticide oversight and why just following the label on a bottle of pesticides isn't enough to protect pollinators. In fact, we want to do much more than just following the label on pesticides. Current federal regulation states that pesticides should have, quote, no unreasonable adverse effects, but that's really open to interpretation. Federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. They just believe that the benefits that are provided by pesticides outweigh the harm that they cause. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or create havens for insects in our homes and yards, that standard isn't enough, which is why we encourage people to go beyond just following what's on the label to find ways to truly protect these species. So there's a long list of ways that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency overseeing pesticides, their assessments underestimate the risk to pollinators, which then leads to harmful pesticide uses. And I'll just quickly list a few of those concerns so you kind of know where we're coming from with this. So these assessments focus only on one chemical at a time, but pesticides are rarely found alone in the environment, whether sampling is of water, of soil, or of pollinator habitat. We actually did a study looking at pesticide residues on milkweed plants up and down California's Central Valley, and we found up to 25 pesticides on a single plant with an average of 9 pesticides per plant. And we almost never know how these pesticides are interacting together and then what that impact on pollinators is. These assessments also tend to not consider the specific risks to native bees and butterflies. For example, contaminated soil for ground nesting bees isn't considered, even though independent research has shown harm. And actually, about 70% of our native bees are ground nesting bees. And then also what this exposure does to the immature stages of insects instead of adults. Another problem with the standard toxicity testing is that the EPA really heavily weighs one outcome in their decision making, which is death. But bees or other invertebrates that are exposed to less than a dose that kills them can have other negative responses. And we call these sublethal effects. And there won't be a quiz on this. I just want to kind of share some of that terminology with you. And sublethal effects are simply anything short of death, such as decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in an insect's learning ability. And many of these impacts might reduce a bee or other insect's ability to reproduce or to gather pollen and nectar for its offspring. So these are things that might not kill an individual, but over time, these small effects can add up at the population level. So with COVID tests still being common these days, lots of people talk about false negatives due to COVID testing. And similarly, you can think of the EPA's risk assessment process as allowing for false negatives in that we miss actual risk. Okay, so bringing these thoughts on pesticides back to our mosquito focus today, our overarching goal is to touch on home mosquito sprays and why they tend not to be as effective as other methods of mosquito management, and why they're detrimental to the populations of beneficial insects in your yards. This includes pollinators like bees, butterflies, natural enemies like lady beetles, ground beetles, parasitoid wasps, pretty much all invertebrates. And I also want to note that successful mosquito management doesn't really happen at the yard level. It happens at the community level. And the topics that we're talking about in this section with pesticides apply to tick control as well, since many of the same chemicals are used to control both ticks and mosquitoes. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit. Home mosquito sprays are often performed by specialized companies. You might get ads and flyers from them. And these companies most commonly spray a group of insecticides called pyrethroids. As a group, these are highly toxic insecticides that kill much more than just mosquitoes. They're broad spectrum, meaning they kill all sorts of other invertebrates as well. Pyrethroids are related to pyrethrins and naturally occurring toxins that are found in chrysanthemum flowers. But pyrethroids are synthetic versions that are made in a lab, and they're similar in structure, but made to be more toxic and more persistent than pyrethrins, though they can also be quite toxic as well. These include, but aren't limited to, bifenthrin, deltamethrin, permethrin. Pyrethroids tend to have thrin at the end of their names, so just kind of something to look out for. And these are some of the chemicals used by these various mosquito spray companies. And risks to insects can vary. The biggest impact is likely to the insects that are out flying or crawling on plants when sprays happen. They get contacted directly by an application spray or fog. And the persistence of these chemicals varies from a few days to a few weeks. And when the more persistent insecticides are used, which is often the case in the barrier sprays that companies apply, this means that they can linger on plant surfaces and create an extra risk, in particular to insects like butterflies and moths, since the caterpillars feed on leaf tissue. So if they're munching down on leaves covered in pyrethroids, that's obviously a big concern. Even if sprays happen in the evening or early morning, there are many insects that are active at these times of days that can be exposed. So to understand the risk from pesticide sprays, there's a couple important components to understand. And one is the hazard or how toxic the pesticide is. And the other is exposure, or how much pesticide was applied. What was the concentration? What was the method? How long was an insect exposed for? And these together add up to the risk, or I guess multiplied together are the risk. So a very toxic pesticide applied once can have a high risk, but so can a less toxic pesticide that's applied numerous times. So in order to protect beneficial insects from pesticides like mosquito sprays, it's important to think about the many ways that an insect can be exposed from these sprays. So as we talked about a couple slides ago, there's direct contact. If an insect is out on a plant or flower that's sprayed and they get the pesticide on them directly. There's also potentially contaminated nesting materials. Many insects, including many different types of bees, will take foliage petals and use them to line nests or create nests. And if these materials are contaminated with pesticides, then both the adults are exposed as well as the immature stages. Indirect contact, walking over a contaminated plant, and then also contaminated nesting sites if an insect is nesting in the ground and a pesticide is applied there. So life cycle, behavior, social structure, these are all important things to consider when we're thinking about any species of concern and understanding the exposure risk to these organisms. So that's kind of beyond just mosquito sprays, but a good thing to think about when you're thinking about protecting invertebrates in your yard from pesticides. So in our urban and suburban areas where these home mosquito sprays occur, the landscape has a huge proportion of impervious surfaces. And what I mean by this are hardscapes, places where water runs right off. This includes things like driveways, sidewalks, patios, roads. Our lawns are often so compacted that they function as impervious surfaces as well. And these hard surfaces make it really easy for pesticide applications to wash off-site and get into our waterways. And in fact, US Geological Survey testing that was done relatively recently found that 91% of the streams that they sampled in urban areas had at least one pesticide that was at levels harmful to aquatic invertebrates. And pyrethroids are particularly toxic to aquatic insects and invertebrates. And beyond impacting these invertebrates directly, there can be wide-ranging impacts because they disrupt the food chain, as birds, fish, and amphibians also rely on these insects for food. I should also note that pyrethroids are also directly toxic to fish. So this is kind of a quick reminder that the things we do in our homes and yards often have broader impacts elsewhere in the landscape. So thinking about home mosquito spraying, beyond being toxic to insects in general, when we're looking at community management and disease control at home, mosquito sprays are ultimately not very effective because they only target the adult mosquitoes, which isn't going to put a very big dent in the overall population. Though you might see mosquito numbers in your yard reduced for a short amount of time, mosquitoes are highly mobile insects, and new ones will quickly fly over the fence from your neighbor's yard, for example. This is a reason that working community-wide is so important. And additionally, new adults can keep emerging from stagnant water in high numbers even after sprays have occurred. So spraying adult mosquitoes is kind of a short-term solution that's site-specific and doesn't really address the broader problem. To compound the issues caused by home mosquito sprays, pest control companies often use all sorts of tactics to try and get people to sign up and participate. They'll send salespeople door to door to try to get people to sign up for preventative or prophylactic sprays, meaning they'll apply pesticides on a regular schedule and not even do any type of monitoring of pest insect populations to kind of justify those applications. I've even heard of discounts being given if multiple people on one block sign up. Some of the language I should say, that companies use is misleading as well. They'll tout their applications as being safe without disclosing what they're spraying, nor mention that the other insects that come in contact with these insecticides will be poisoned or potentially die as well. So a well-intentioned resident or homeowner just trying not to get bitten might think that these applications only kill mosquitoes and that hiring these companies isn't causing any type of ecological harm, when in fact they are toxic to the broader insect communities in their yard. There's also often an element of what we call greenwashing. When asked, they'll often say that these chemicals they're using are natural or just derived from flowers, when in fact they are synthetic and toxic. Even if they are just spraying pyrethrum, it is still toxic. Just because something's natural doesn't mean it's safe. There's also outfits that will sell automated mosquito misting systems. These are permanent installations, often along fences, that automatically spray insecticides on a schedule to kill mosquitoes in your yard. I found one that advertises that their mister sprays only twice a day for 30 to 60 seconds, and they tend to use pyrethrum or pyrethroids. And you can imagine how much of an impact these regular applications may be having on pollinator and beneficial insect populations in the yard if they're spraying for up to 2 minutes every single day. So some companies will also offer these, organic or essential oil sprays. I've heard of peppermint, garlic, oregano, cedar oil, others. Though there is research that shows effectiveness as products that you apply to your skin as kind of a repellent, there isn't a lot of compelling research that shows they're really effective at controlling mosquitoes as a yard spray. So it seems like their value is probably more in being a repellent, though how long that repellency even lasts in a yard isn't really known or obvious. But I should note that these oils still do pose some level of toxicity to the larvae of bees and other insects. They're not risk-free. We classify several of them as moderately toxic to larval bees in our organic pesticides fact sheet, which is pictured here if you're interested in looking at it more. And one other thought that both relates to these organic sprays as well as non-organic and conventional pesticide sprays as well, is that these sprays have other what are called inert ingredients, which are things that have been added to the mixture to help the pesticide spread or stick evenly, for example. And many of these haven't been tested. And many are actually trade secrets. So we don't know what risk they pose to pollinators and other insects. Sometimes studies actually find that these inert ingredients are actually more toxic to invertebrates than the active ingredients, the pesticide themselves are. So I think it's important to circle back again and note that spraying for adults isn't, the most effective long-term solution, and using simple, more effective management options that ends up with you avoiding the need to spray for adult mosquitoes at all, even with least toxic options like essential oils, is really the way to go. Okay, I also really want to touch really quickly on humans and pets. This is outside of the realm of my expertise, but I know it's something people are very interested in, so I wanted just to include a slide. So first, a little known fact is that bifenthrin, this is one of those pyrethroids, along with many other pesticides, is actually considered a PFAS or a forever chemical by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So this being used so widely is obviously of environmental concern, human health concern, along with the many other PFAS issues you read about, contaminating our soils and waters. Additionally, bifenthrin and many other pesticides are classified as possible carcinogens by the EPA. And I do want to note that pyrethroids do have neurotoxicity, and that there are studies that have found exposure to pyrethroids, for women during pregnancies or in early childhood are linked to adverse effects like cognitive development, behavioral issues, things like that in children. And also quickly highlighting pets, pyrethroids are highly toxic to cats because they can't break down the pesticides quickly in their bodies. And I do want to note that these findings for toxicity for humans and pets are often from labs or from other types of exposure or kind of general correlative studies, not from mosquito sprays in particular. So it's really hard to say what the risk is from these applications. Obviously, pesticide companies, the agencies that are actually applying them, believe that they're safe. But I just wanted to bring up some of the potential concerns with these chemicals that are so widely used. Okay, so to kind of highlight some of these on-the-ground risks that these home sprays pose, I want to do a quick little digression and share some very preliminary data from a study that we performed this past summer, which I'm very excited about. We wanted to try to quantify how much of a risk there is to pollinators and beneficial insects from these home mosquito sprays, in particular from neighboring yards. Because one question that we get a lot is, I'm building a pollinator habitat, or I have this great pollinator habitat that I've been growing for years, but my neighbor sprays for mosquitoes. Is this something I should be concerned about? Am I potentially creating what's called an ecological trap, and risking the health of these pollinators and other invertebrates? And we still don't yet, but have a great answer for that, knowing like what is the potential drift and deposition of these residues from neighboring sprays. So we were able to get volunteers in Georgia, Iowa, and then also Massachusetts, who had neighbors who sprayed, had a vector control truck go by their street, or as it turned out, we got a number of volunteers who actually have their yard sprayed themselves. Which I didn't go into this experiment thinking we would find that, but I think it just goes to show how common these sprays are, even among people who are kind of ecologically minded. And we had them put these silicone bands out as passive monitors out in their yard before a spray event occurred. So just think those like Livestrong bracelets, basically. Chemicals stick really well to silicone. So we were able to capture all of the pesticides that were applied. Sorry, not all, but all that were applied to the band. And then we had volunteers package them up, put them in their freezer, and then we shipped them off to a lab for analysis. So again, yeah, we got people who had their yards actively sprayed themselves. We had people whose neighbors sprayed their yard, and then we had the vector control district sprays. All of those, I think, were via a truck. So we just got the data back. It was like a month and a half ago, so we're still working on kind of figuring out how to analyze it best. But I have some very preliminary results to share with you. So every yard with a hired mosquito spray company had pyrethroid residues at levels that were toxic to honeybees, and it was many times above the LD50, which is the lethal dose that kills 50% of bees in a laboratory study. So that's obviously something that's concerning. Contamination varied in yards adjacent to neighbors that sprayed. Some yards who had a neighbor who sprayed had no residues. Some had low to moderate levels, but a few did have levels that were above the level that was toxic to honeybees. Bifenthrin, this pyrethroid that I keep mentioning, was detected in 53 out of 70 samples, and there were multiple pyrethroids detected in 25 out of the 70 samples. So this kind of shows how widespread these chemicals are. So this brings up a lot of questions that we're trying to work to grapple with and answer. One of our questions is, what do these contamination levels mean for other organisms? We have a lot more data on honeybees because they're kind of the model organism for a lot of pesticide risk testing. So we have those LD50s, that term I used. But for a lot of other insects, we don't necessarily have all of that information. So we're trying to figure out the best way to look at what this means for, maybe bumblebees or a really small native bee, some of those little tiny bees that are, a serotina bee that's about the size of a grain of rice, or what does this mean to various types of butterflies and moths? And then, we talked about those sublethal effects earlier. What other harm might be caused even if a bee or other invertebrate isn't killed? So, as I mentioned, those neighboring yards sometimes had, kind of low to moderate amounts of pyrethroids deposited on those bands. And we're curious, what does that mean? Is this at a level that might impact their reproduction or their ability to navigate? So we're kind of trying to dive into the literature to get a grasp on that. Another thing, since we're finding multiple pesticides in these yards, what are the additive or synergistic effects caused by exposure to multiple mosquito control insecticides, as well as other pesticides that are just out in our suburban and urban areas? For a lot of pesticides that have the same what are called mode of action, there's an additive effect. So multiple pyrethroids, you can almost just add up the amount of residues, and kind of get a total impact. But sometimes there's insecticides, and different pesticides that will interact synergistically. So this is the case with some fungicides, that if they're present with an insecticide, they actually make them more toxic because they decrease the bee or other invertebrates' ability to detoxify that insecticide. So trying to get a sense of, are there these additive or synergistic effects? And then also, what are the chronic impacts from repeated spraying? If these sprays are happening biweekly or monthly, even at levels that are lower, kind of going back to that risk slide, if these invertebrates are being exposed to low levels, but it's happening, for like a bumblebee colony, for example, that's there the whole summer, and they're getting small amounts of pesticides, every other week or every month. What impact does that have? So these are all things that we kind of need to dive in. Hopefully, with the data, we can look at this a little bit more, or maybe we can do more studies in the next summers. Okay, well, thank you for sticking with me through that lengthy pesticide section. So now that we've talked about the downsides of chemical mosquito control, let's start talking about what you can do to help managing mosquitoes at home. And the number one thing that you can do is simply to eliminate standing water. This is also called source reduction. And what this does is it removes breeding habitat for mosquitoes, and it really is the single most effective thing you can do. And it's imperative to start doing this early because this will help keep mosquito populations from building. Since they can lay hundreds of eggs and all they need is a bottle cap of water, you really have to be diligent to try and find all of those little hidden places where water might be pooling in your yard. As we talked about earlier, adults lay their eggs in still water where they hatch and develop. And since this entire process can take only 8 to 10 days, and mosquitoes only need that small amount of water, water that stands around for just over a week can lead to a population explosion. So dump water from buckets and trash cans. Look for hidden flower pots or old tires that might have filled with rain. I really suggest also checking to see if your gutters are clogged, because this can be a surprise kind of unseen source of stagnant water. And then finally, every few days, dump and refill water sources like pet bowls and bird baths that are kind of, always out there in your yard, to prevent any mosquito larvae from being able to complete their life cycle. You can also look for places like driveway potholes to fill in, or even depressions in your lawn that you can kind of raise, because these can harbor puddles that mosquitoes can actually utilize as breeding habitat. And again, it's really essential to start doing this early, as this will help prevent mosquito populations from exploding as the summer progresses. If you have a permanent body of water, like a backyard pond, there are things that you can and should do to control mosquitoes. As I keep saying, mosquitoes can only reproduce in still water, so the simple inclusion of a small water feature like a waterfall or even just a little pump to keep the water circulating a little bit is all that's needed to make your pond inhospitable to mosquitoes. If you do use an open water pump, um, add some sort of protective screening to the intake area, since these pumps can pull in dragonfly and damselfly nymphs and kill them. And beyond just wanting to conserve these insects for their own sake, you want to keep dragonflies and damselflies in your yard and pond to help control mosquito larvae, which we'll talk about now. So a great thing that you can do is encouraging natural enemies. So natural enemies are other organisms that eat a pest in nature. So a variety of insects will eat mosquitoes as well as many birds and bats. Research has shown that diverse native plantings harbor larger, more diverse populations of insect natural enemies. Native plants, research in Doug Tallamy's lab at the University of Delaware on native trees. Native trees have been found to increase native insect populations that in turn support more birds, which can, of course, eat all sorts of insects, including mosquitoes. So plant native plants in a variety of different types, sizes, shapes. This all will support a diversity of different types of natural enemies that will control pests in your yard. I do want to note that predation by birds and bats likely won't have a noticeable effect on the population in your yards, but it's still a good thing to do, and it will help create a functioning ecosystem in your yard, and it can't hurt. Aquatic habitat, though, is a different story. So again, going back, if you do have a pond or something in your yard, larval biological control is much more effective. So if you have a pond or wetland area, you can manage it to better support those natural enemies that will feed on mosquito larvae. So larval predators like dragonflies and damselflies will have a larger impact on mosquito populations, and they all have the same basic needs. They need clean water, food, and then habitat that serves as a refuge to kind of mate and reproduce in. So a diversity of aquatic vegetation is important to include because it will take up nutrients, it oxygenates and cools the water, and it's also used as shelter by the juvenile stages of these insects. For the adults, vegetation will provide perches when they're seeking mates, and also a place to lay eggs. Vegetation outside the pond area, kind of upland, is important as well because it provides a place for insects like dragonflies to roost, hunt, and mate. This is getting maybe a little beyond the scope of this talk, but we do have a resource for managing backyard ponds for dragonflies and damselflies available in our online library that includes lots of details talking about pond construction, location, plant choice, and more. So I encourage you to check that out if it's of interest to you. So beyond just getting rid of standing water, there are other preventative measures you can take to avoid being bitten. So you can protect yourself from bites by simply wearing long sleeves when mosquitoes are active, using a repellent, and making sure your window screens are intact so you don't allow mosquitoes into your house or apartment. You can also put out a fan when you're sitting outdoors because mosquitoes are really poor flyers and can't fly in even very light winds. So that's a great way to enjoy your patio or your porch during mosquito season. So these might sound simple or obvious, but they're methods that really do work. So I have a quick real-world example of how powerful and important these simple preventative measures can be. This also relates to community-level change, which we'll touch on a little bit at the end. So Fort Collins in Colorado has a really great success story in mosquito vector disease management that kind of highlights that importance of prevention at home. So in 2003, there was a big West Nile outbreak. Residents in both Fort Collins and then Loveland, which is a town just south of Fort Collins, were surveyed. And the surveys found that Fort Collins residents were much more likely to implement personal protective measures like wearing long sleeves and applying repellent and avoiding outdoor activities when mosquitoes were most active. So despite the fact that Fort Collins had a greater abundance of mosquitoes and more West Nile positive mosquitoes compared to Loveland, Fort Collins actually had half as many incidences of severe disease, likely because the community used these preventative measures. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about adulticides, but I want to touch on larvicides. So these are pesticides that kill larval mosquitoes. Some of you might be familiar with them, like BT dunks that you can buy and use at home. So the active ingredient is a species of bacteria that lives in the soil and is often used as an insecticide. There's a strain used in what are called these mosquito dunks, which are pucks that are placed in water that dissolve and are marketed as only killing mosquitoes. While these pucks are fairly targeted, these dunks do actually kill all flies in the mosquito family, which includes things like midges, shoreflies, and gnats. And these insects do play roles in the ecosystem, and we would rather not kill them. We also don't know if there are any sublethal effects that these dunks have on other insects or on things like soil biota when the water is dumped out. So this is why at home, we recommend first considering other options like removing stagnant water or refilling bird baths, since it's easy and has no risk or downsides. Sometimes municipalities need to use larvicides to control disease, vectoring mosquito outbreaks. BT is often used as a least toxic option, but sometimes agencies also use more broadly toxic insecticides. Larval biocontrols are sometimes used by vector control districts, like fish predators, for example, and these can definitely have an effect, but are complicated by the decision of whether certain species are suitable for introduction into certain areas, and these aren't something that would normally be used at home by a resident. I also wanted to quickly touch on bug zappers and diffusers. You might see ads for products like Thermacell that diffuse or emit what they are calling repellents. But in fact, these products don't just repel insects, but actually release more pyrethroid insecticides to kill insects. And as we've discussed a lot already today, these insecticides could harm any number of other beneficial insects. And since these products are marketed as repellents, people could easily get the impression that they somehow work like DEET or one of the other many natural repellents that are on the market. And it would require a savvy consumer to understand that they're buying a product that releases a broad spectrum insecticide that not only kills mosquitoes, but could also harm a variety of other beneficial insects. Um, and again, while this isn't my area of expertise, I hope people also kind of think about, potential risks to children, the elderly, or other vulnerable populations, potentially from, frequent or prolonged use of these products. The term pesticide spray often makes some people uncomfortable. So the marketing copy for some of these products that repeatedly states that chemicals aren't sprayed is also a bit misleading since chemicals are still being emitted into the area. Turning to bug zappers, in short, they really indiscriminately draw in insects and can kill many beneficials, including fireflies, unfortunately, and really aren't that useful for controlling mosquitoes. For example, there was a short study done at the University of Florida where they had one bug zapper out for a night, and about 10,000 insects were killed by the zapper, and only 8 of them were mosquitoes. I've also heard numbers, the research has estimated that there's, several million bug zappers in use across the United States, operating for an average of 40 nights per year and killing at least 71 billion harmless or beneficial insects, like moths, for example. So bug zappers end up killing a lot of beneficial insects, unfortunately. Okay, so moving on to our next organism, I also wanted to include some information on ticks, even though I don't have as much material on them or all the answers, unfortunately. But ticks are arachnids, meaning that they're closely related to spiders, and they have 4 life stages: egg, larva, nymph, and then adult. Larval ticks have 6 legs, while nymph and adult ticks have 8 legs. And tick habitat can vary depending on the species and the life stage, from underbrush and leaf litter to tall grass to the burrows of their mammal hosts. Excuse me. And they need areas with relatively high humidity to survive. So in Northeast residential areas, so likely where you all live, about 2/3 of ticks are found in wooded areas, followed by about 22% in the edge of the woods, where the woods or shrub area meets a lawn or a yard. And about 9% are found in ornamental vegetation, and less than 2% of ticks in residential areas are actually found in short grass lawns. So this kind of gives you an idea of where they live. So this might be a review for many of you who live with these creatures, but ticks can't jump or fly. They can only crawl, and they use a behavior called questing to seek out their hosts, where they crawl up vegetation and perch at the end and wait. for a host to come by. And larvae tend to stay closer to the ground while mature ticks climb higher. So they use cues like heat, carbon dioxide, vibrations to detect their host. And once they get on, some bite and feed right away, while others might crawl around a little bit first before they bite their hosts. They feed for several days to weeks, depending on the species and if it's a male or a female tick. So in the Northeast and other areas of the US, we encounter a lot of ticks that can carry diseases and pathogens. And many at-home tick treatments, unfortunately, can be highly toxic to pollinators. The same suite of chemicals used for mosquitoes is often sprayed for ticks, including many different pyrethroids. Tick control pesticides can also include neonicotinoids, which are synthetic compounds that are similar to nicotine, and they can last for a really long time in soils. And widespread use of neonicotinoids is one driver of bee population declines. So there are a few studies, but still not many, that have found essential oil treatments, having some level of effectiveness against ticks, in particular nymphal ticks, because they're, less mobile than mosquitoes. But they don't seem to provide complete control. And again, these do carry some risks to non-target species. If something kills or deters ticks, then they're going to be killing or deterring other insects as well. These can also be expensive because they last less time and require more frequent treatment. So if we think of that risk equation again, the more treatments increases the exposure and potential impacts to the insects that you want to protect. So in general, research suggests that personal protection is the most important step in reducing the risk of tick bites and disease transmission, meaning long sleeves and perhaps permethrin-infused clothing. I know this isn't a satisfying kind of magic solution, but there are strong reductions in tick attachment and survival when wearing permethrin-infused clothing. This is less likely to harm people, pets, or other wildlife than a barrier spray applied to a yard. Habitat-wise, since forests are the largest source for nymphal ticks in these mixed residential landscapes in the Northeast, the area where most ticks, in yards are found are kind of at those wooded edges, particularly if that understory is dense and contains non-native shrubs that attract tick hosts, like Japanese barberry, which is in particular very associated with tick populations. As we mentioned, ticks like humid environments, so they'll be more present in tall grass than short grass. So in light of this, there are landscape modifications that you can do around the yard. And one is removing ground cover, barberry, and leaf litter in places people visit. Another is keeping turf grass recreation areas mowed short. And then finally, discouraging rodent activity as well. Another tip is creating a barrier strip of gravel or wood chips on the edge of your yard. And this can help minimize the migration of those host-seeking ticks into lawn areas, because it increases the buffer area between woods and shrubs in the lawn, since most tick nymphs are found within a few meters of that edge. So earlier in this talk, I mentioned that mosquitoes are controlled at the community level. So it's really important to do your part and eliminate standing water in your yard, which will hopefully give you some population reduction. But as we learned earlier, mosquitoes are mobile. So no matter what you do, if your neighbor has great mosquito habitat, lots of standing water, you'll still see mosquitoes going into your yard looking for blood meals. So what can you do kind of at the community and grassroots level? At the neighborhood level, it might not be simple, but try talking to your neighbors about mosquito management and source reduction. I'd of course encourage you to start with neighbors that you already have a good relationship with. And for those that you haven't communicated with much before, maybe breaking the ice with other topics is likely better than jumping straight in on mosquito management and pesticide use. An inspiration for me comes from my boss, Amay's neighborhood. That has a neighborhood pledge not to use pesticides that was actually started by a 6-year-old child who went around door to door. And she says that to this day, when somebody new moves into the neighborhood, someone asks them to take the pledge. So a whole neighborhood of people who are practicing, common sense mosquito management and source reduction will have a much larger impact than just, one yard. And we have materials in our Xerces library that I can share that would be useful in sharing with interested neighbors. At the community level, there are grassroots things you can do, and it sounds like, Lexington Living Landscapes is already doing a lot of this work, which is really wonderful. It was fun to kind of learn about all of the work that you all have been up to. But for more inspiration, a great example of a broader community-wide campaign is Decatur, Georgia. They're part of the Xerces Bee City USA program, in which affiliate communities make several commitments to protect pollinators. And one of these is pesticide reduction. And Decatur has created a really great education program by expanding the information section that they have about residential mosquito spraying on their Bee City website, developing literature to hand out, and creating these great large mosquito spraying kills bees branded signs to put in yard, like the ones pictured. As part of their education campaign, they make use of social media. They table at events like farmers markets and nurseries, at town events like parades. They do presentations to neighborhood associations and community groups, and then also work with the city's Environmental Sustainability Board to enact formal policies that emphasize alternatives to chemical controls. And then speaking of pledges, they also have a not spraying for mosquitoes pledge as a central tenet of their ongoing Decatur Pollinator Pledge program to keep properties pollinator friendly. So I think this is a really inspiring way that community members have come together to kind of do this outreach and education. So as I kind of wrap up here, I want to encourage you all to think of your yard as habitat. You know, your yard is being used by this broad community of other insects, birds, and animals, in addition to insects that can be nuisances like mosquitoes. And the choices that we make in green spaces and residential landscapes really can have wide-reaching impacts on biodiversity. And I really encourage you all to think about that broad community of other life when you're making management decisions. And I want to end by reemphasizing that you really can make a difference at home. Habitat loss and fragmentation is the leading cause of species extinctions. But the great news is that insects are really able to use these small patches, partial habitats like yards and parks, and improvements to our habitats at home really can have dramatic results. And beyond just planting habitat plants, protecting these spaces from pesticides is one of the most important things you can do to provide habitat for invertebrates. And again, I want to note that we have a number of mosquito-related resources in our Xerces library, including one on supporting ecologically sound mosquito management, a longer one that's helping your community create an effective mosquito management plan. Excuse me, I have a little cough. One on ecologically sound mosquito management in wetlands, and then the one I mentioned earlier on creating backyard pond habitat for dragonflies and damselflies. And with that, I think we have time for questions. And if anybody has any follow-up questions or something comes to you later, sorry, I'm so sorry.
We'll let Aaron cough and have some water for a moment. Thank you so much, Aaron. There was so much information on quite a few important topics. They're all related. So I appreciate your bringing them in this holistic manner to us. For those who joined us a little bit late, I just want to remind you to put the questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. That's where I'm looking for them, and I'm going to be relaying questions to Aaron, who looks like he's recovered.
Thank you. And what I was just going to say is that if anything comes to you later, or there's a question that I can't answer right now that you want follow up on, feel free to send an email to my email right there. It's aaron.anderson@xerces.org.
That's great. Thanks, Aaron. So let's see. We have quite a few questions about dunks. So maybe I'll start with that. And they're on a variety. They're in a variety of aspects. So for one thing, I think maybe I'll start with the wetlands. There's some people who mentioned specifically a different town they live in the Q&A, but that is an issue here in Lexington as well as an issue at my own backyard. That we do have a lot of areas with very high water table. It's a wet year, so we have extra wetlands than we have had some other years, and there are actually just a lot of wetlands here in town. And so even if you're managing your standing water on in your own yard, maybe part of your yard's wetlands, or there may be conservation land nearby. So people are wondering about the use of mosquito dunks because they cannot remove the standing water from the wetlands to help manage that larval stage. And I realize the question is going to be different whether you're talking about a little koi pond that you don't have a bubbler right in your yard versus actually wetlands, which should be more protected for what you put in them. Like you
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, there are unfortunately certainly times where, like, especially if it's the surrounding landscape context of your yard is full of lots of wetlands and places where there are sources, it's impossible to kind of control populations all of the time. I think that, and I think obviously some of those spaces would, fall under the management of your municipal control district. And hopefully they have, I kind of looked at the site for the one for Lexington, at least. I know we probably have people from around the state and region. And it seems like they have a pretty good program where, they're monitoring for the mosquitoes that cause the vector diseases, and also looking for the incidence of disease before they're deciding how to treat. But I think for properties on your own, if it's on your own property, it's kind of a trade-off. Again, these dunks aren't fully risk-free. They do impact other closely related flies to mosquitoes. And I think most often when they're sold to the home gardener, they're meant for use in these smaller spaces, like you were saying, like a koi pond or something like that. I don't feel qualified to say whether or not in a larger scale wetland it's something that even would be very effective, and how many you would even need to put in. So I would think I would steer clear of suggesting people do that. For the smaller bodies of water, like a koi pond, my first recommendation would be try doing something like a little water feature just to keep that water moving, because that's going to keep the water moving and make it inhospitable to mosquitoes, without using anything that might even have a little bit of extra risk. I don't know if that fully answered that question, but there's
I mean, I
definitely
think
times.
there's not like a maybe an easy solution for people who live near wetlands to
Right.
really
If
reduce
you
the
live near
population.
a wetlands, I think I would definitely just lean harder on some of those preventative measures, unfortunately.
Still
Um,
worthwhile to dump the water that's sitting in my wheelbarrow now, but yeah.
yes,
And
exactly.
then a related question, somebody was asking about those the trapping approach using mosquito dunks in a bucket of standing water that
Yeah.
has been promoted by some folks. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's something that if people want to do, I'm certainly not going to discourage them. I think what from our kind of perspective, for the the evidence that one mosquito trap in your yard is going to have a large impact on mosquito populations. Um, there's not a ton of evidence for that. So that's just simply why we're not, suggesting it as a resource. Like, this is definitely going to reduce mosquito populations. One other thing is that if you can create these dunks or these traps and remember to dump them weekly without even putting the dunk in itself, then that's a good way to potentially be reducing the populations without any non-target impacts. But I know on the flip side, if you forget, then all of a sudden that trap can turn into a big source of
Yeah.
mosquitoes, which is, yeah.
Actually,
But
that makes me think about what you were talking about in the beginning of your talk about how many eggs a mosquito can release, but that also she can lay eggs on multiple days and in multiple locations. And so I'm I would be curious. I don't know if anyone has studied whether there are any population impacts of creating traps, whether
yeah,
it's not just an extra source of water versus that doesn't have an effect either way.
yeah, I've tried to do some reading on that, and a lot of the results I found are fairly anecdotal, which is great. If this is working for you, that's that's wonderful. I have found research where kind of similar traps have been used kind of in a more community-wide kind of disease management approach. One study I think was in Puerto Rico, where they put out hundreds of these traps across one neighborhood and then not in a different neighborhood. And they did find really significant mosquito population reductions. But, if you're putting out 5 traps in every single yard across an entire neighborhood, that's going to be different than just you in your yard having a couple of traps. Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
one of those things that's hard to say.
other type of neighborhood collaboration. So thanks for
Exactly, yeah.
um so that's getting sort of at source management in the larval stage, as you very clearly pointed out. Managing at the larval stage is going to be just so much more effective than managing at the adult stage, and why. So thank you for making that super clear.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of folks that are interested in these essential oil repellent approaches, not just for the mosquitoes, but also for the ticks and that questing behavior we're talking about at like the periphery of a preschool playground, for example, where my children went. They wanted that because they believe that was way less toxic
Yeah.
and preventative for their health than spraying something else. And their goal was just to prevent questing into the preschool, fenced off playground area where tree branches kind of come over the edge and stuff like that. I don't know if there's a question with that other than like maybe there's a certain uses for them versus just blanketing your yard.
Yeah, I think that if you are going to use them, one of the suggestions is, having a more targeted approach, right? Where, like you were saying, it's more on the border as opposed to blanketing the entire yard. Yeah, I think that's an appropriate way to kind of, reduce the potential risk and, not be putting as many of these chemicals out into your yard, into the environment, and the potential impacts on targets. And yeah, I think that, like you said, I think there's just unfortunately trade-offs with a lot of these kind of chemical solutions where it's like, okay, the essential oils, there is some evidence that they are, they do control, especially at some stages, the nymphal ticks. But from what I was reading, you have to reapply them much more frequently. They're not providing 100% control, so ticks are still going to be able to kind of make their way in and quest, like you were saying. So combining it or trying some of these other methods as well, creating some sort of a barrier as well is something I think that is a good non-chemical method to try to kind of mitigate some of that behavior. And again, like I was saying, in the kind of research surveying tick habitat, not very many ultimately are found in the mowed kind of grassy areas. So keeping those areas mowed, trying to make sure that some of those, kind of humid undergrowth habitat aren't right by those areas where, people are recreating or children are playing is another good method to try to mitigate those tick encounters.
Yeah, I think sometimes some of the other foci of our group are, reducing lawn area and having more native plants. And I think one of the things we've been trying to encourage people is to just be thoughtful about, if there are areas where you're going to be spending time sitting on the ground, maybe that's the area you keep your turf grass and keep it mowed really short. And then the areas where you're not doing that are maybe the places where you have the taller vegetation, because a budding forest, as many of us are here in town, with a lot of wildlife moving in, tick management is a really important strategy for sure. So go ahead.
Oh no, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
One thing I'm actually just thinking back about the source management. You're talking again about how resilient mosquito eggs are if the water in a bottle cap drips down and they're on the side, they can survive over winter. You didn't mean this far north, I think.
No, sorry. Yeah, that was just in more southern areas they can overwinter like that as eggs and be ready to go.
Maybe in 20 years we'll have that problem here, but thankfully not right now. But I wanted to just point out how not nearly as resilient the larvae are once they are swimming around. So when you dump that water out, they're not just gonna survive in the larval state, like they're gonna die.
Exactly. If you dump them out, they're gonna die. Yep.
Yeah. And
then even if you did dump out the eggs, if they're on the ground, they're never gonna be submerged in water again.
Good point.
So then they're also gonna die. But yeah, like you said, the larvae, if you dump them out, they'll die.
I had one other question I was thinking about a little earlier today, which was there are in some parts of the US, I think mostly Florida and California, projects going on considering sterile male release as another way to reduce, not that we're going to do that here in Massachusetts, but I know that's part of like their vector control, not just, do you know if that's been successful at reducing populations or reducing disease incidence? And I guess for people who don't know, they're talking about releasing male mosquitoes, which, as Erin explained, do not bite people, but they do mate with female mosquitoes, and if there are some genetically modified ones that produce like offspring that cannot survive and reproduce themselves.
Yeah, you know what? I don't actually know about, I was kind of reading just a little bit about that earlier. I don't actually know the efficacy of some of those kind of stateside programs. So that'd be something I'd be happy to look up and email an answer to anybody who's interested in. Yeah, no, it's a great question though.
I was just curious about it. It's not as relevant
Yeah.
right here. People had a number of questions about the kinds of repellents and strategies we use to protect ourselves too, which I know is where you're trying to help us understand how important that is. So one of the questions that I thought was a very reasonable question to ask after we've talked about the harms of those synthetic pesticides based on the chrysanthemum pesticide when we treat them on our own clothes, which is a strategy I use in my household, especially with my kids. How safe is it for us to be, and how effective is that also at repelling mosquitoes and ticks from us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's very effective. That's one of the key things that people recommend, especially for ticks, is yeah, there's much less tick attachment and disease transfer when people are wearing permethrin infused clothing. And your question is a really good one as far as the risk. I obviously things can be pass through our skin. And there is research that shows that people who wear permethrin soaked the clothing, trace permethrin can be found in urine and things like that. But that's also the case in people that are around all sorts of other pyrethroid kind of sprays and things like that. I don't actually know the quantities and how that compares. I think obviously risk, like anything, depends on how frequently you're wearing things. The EPA, though I was just talking about how the risk assessment, but the risk assessment when it comes to people tends to be, that's where they don't want to see risk. But they their assessments say that wearing permethrin soaked clothing is safe. So I don't have any further information on that, but it's definitely one of the recommendations, especially if you're in a really kind of tick infested area, to avoid getting something that's really harmful, like Lyme disease. So
right, I'll say like in my family we use it to reduce how much DEET we have to wear on our skin if it's going to be on our clothing too.
totally, yeah. And I think too, where yeah, I used to live in upstate New York and worked in some very ticky areas and definitely did a lot of permethrin soaked clothing because otherwise they'd just be kind of crawling all over you.
Yes, they will. Let's see. And people were thinking about other things they might use outside. You mentioned fans, as I've also seen it. That's a very effective way. If you're sitting out enjoying an evening on your deck, you can
Yeah.
direct a fan towards people and you won't be bothered by the mosquitoes. A nice breeze does the same. What about like the citronella candles? How, like, they're different than those diffusers. I think in some ways they have more simple chemistry usually.
Yeah. The citronella candles, yeah, it's essentially an oil. It's geraniol oil, I believe, is citronella. Which is, yeah, of course, very different than these diffusers, which have these synthetic insecticides that are designed to kill, not to actually repel. And from what I've read, honestly, citronella candles aren't necessarily any more effective than burning anything else. It's mostly kind of the smoke that's making mosquitoes kind of not
Not
come and
fine.
visit you. Yeah. So it's one of those things that, if you're seeing success using them, I'm not going to discourage you, but I don't, they're certainly not.
They're not on the harmful list.
Right, they're not like a magic thing. And then so citronella is often sometimes used in some of these essential oil sprays. And again, some of the same disclaimers where it's, certainly seems to have some element of a repellency, but then there is also potential, non-target effects to other insects, or at least repellency. If you spray some flowers with it, bees might not go visit those flowers because they also don't want the smell.
Related to that, somebody was asking, I guess related in the sense of it being a plant-based thing. Are there herbs or plants that mosquitoes avoid? Like, are there things you could be growing in your yard to deter?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I see various recommendations sometimes, but ultimately, what my research has found is that none of those things are really going to make a significant difference in
Like there's
mosquito
a
populations in your
lot.
yard. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Someone's asking, what's the best way to wash containers to eliminate eggs surviving even when dry? I'll say put them in your freezer.
Yeah.
Maybe not good for a large one. So a large containers people have in their yards, and they're trying to do good by doing them is rain barrels. And so I guess we're talking about, dumping water, standing water as an effective way. We don't want to do that with our rain barrels. Is that a
Yeah.
place where it would be reasonable to use a dunk because
So
you're not trying to cultivate a biome in there?
right, no, that's true. Yeah. One of the things that we would suggest for rain barrels is simply to try to put like a fine mesh covering on it or something like that that will simply physically exclude mosquitoes from being able to go in and you know, reproduce, lay their eggs. You know, if that doesn't work, then maybe you could try other methods. But I'd encourage that first, just because it's, simple. Just try to cover it with some sort of fine mesh.
Thanks. Oh, well, here's a lovely mosquito behavior question. How far do mosquitoes fly? Because if there's a wetland a quarter mile from me, are they coming to my place, or do they not travel that far?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, it depends a little bit on species and then also wind. Because they're so small, they can really be blown far by wind. So, I think I've heard a couple hundred meters for normally in kind of still environments, but unfortunately, if it is windy, they can potentially distribute much farther. So yeah, unfortunately, a little bit hard to say.
And I'll just add like the matrix, or like what type of vegetation is between you
Oh,
and the wetland will affect the movement of all insects a lot as well.
that's a really great point. Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, I don't, this is specific and technical, but it is about the movement of water in pumps. And I don't know whether you can answer this, or maybe this might be something you can get back to the person about. We have a small 2-level pond that pumps water from the lower section to the upper section with a small waterfall between. That sounds lovely.
It
Maybe
does. Yeah.
200 gallons total with 80 gallons per hour pump. Is that amount of water movement enough to prevent mosquitoes from breeding?
I'm not familiar with specifics of, different pumps for water futures, but I would imagine yes. I mean, as long as the water is moving a little bit, it sounds like you have a pump and a little waterfall. That should be sufficient. You're just trying to avoid the stagnant water that's just sitting there and not moving at all.
Do mosquitoes lay eggs in moist soil or wood chip piles or leaf litter?
That's a great question. So they do need that water to reproduce, but adults will, especially during the day when it's warmer and drier, they'll find some of these kind of shady, more cool, humid areas, like some of those areas that you kind of just described, and they'll kind of roost there or hang out there. So they won't reproduce there. But if you do kind of remove some of that, if you do have potentially a kind of wooded area that has some of what you're describing there, again, this is a little bit tentative, but you might be able to reduce kind of like that resident daytime population that's hanging out there, because that's the type of place that adult mosquito would roost during the day.
I see a couple of tick questions, but I on this one more mosquito question about which is less about managing them, but managing your own personal interaction with them. Someone has heard that mosquitoes are drawn to people with type O blood. I have heard and read this as well. And that's that person. I will say I'm also one of those, and they are the family's mosquito magnet, as am I. We share a lot in common. And I'll just mention to this person that the more heat you emit also, so people who are exercising a lot and flush, you're going to attract more mosquitoes too, which is not great to hear as we're heading into warm weather. but there are things that attract mosquitoes to us in general, whether you are the mosquito person in your family or not. Maybe do you want to touch on some of those things that we know mosquitoes use to detect a host?
Yeah, no, I think that yeah, they're mosquitoes, like you were just saying, like heat, CO2, these are all things that mosquitoes will use to try to detect a host. So yeah, unfortunately, like you were saying, Sarah, when you're exercising or it's hot out and you're warm and breathing hard, these are all things that mosquitoes will use. And unfortunately, I've kind of read about the type O blood thing too. I don't know much about it, to be honest. Unfortunately, if that's you under any of these
Yeah,
circumstances, maybe, just get friends with other people who are, even
yeah.
warmer than you. No, just
Right.
joking.
You don't have to out from the
Yeah,
shirt,
I
just your
think unfortunately this is one of those situations where those preventative measures, again, not to just keep talking about those, but wearing long sleeves, and then if you are hanging out and having a nice evening on your porch or your patio, just setting up a couple fans, because again,
Absolutely.
mosquitoes can only fly 1 to 2 miles an hour or so, and if the wind's faster than that, they're just going to be unable to land on you and fly in the area. So just doing some of those preventative things is a way to, yeah, even if you have type O blood or you run warm, it's a good way to kind of try to prevent mosquitoes.
Absolutely. I'm going to switch to a tick question because I'm realizing that we talked about things to manage your landscape or what to wear on your body to try to minimize being bitten by a tick. Someone's asking about when they are doing gardening work at low, like maybe they're talking about some plants that are only maybe 12 to 24 inches tall. So they're pretty low to the ground. They're asking about, is that low ground cover a risk? Like talking about maybe what animals carry the ticks into our landscapes and like what
Yeah,
height they travel at might help us understand. And then the tick behavior as the ticks kind of crawl out to where they're going to go questing. And then of course, I'll just mention like always, if you're like, you should just check your body when you come in and remove a tick. They're not going to transmit anything to you while you're gardening.
I think that's actually a great point, Sarah, and I should have mentioned that in my talk, that doing regular tick checks, daily, if you're going outside, is really key, because you can have the best prevention in the world, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the tick isn't going to find its way onto you. And unfortunately, my answer here to this question is it really depends, because it depends on the species of tick and then also its life stage. So the more juvenile ticks, from what I understand, stay lower to the ground on lower vegetation. So something that's close to the ground, a lower grass is a place that you might encounter them. And there's certain species that are going to be more on small mammals like mice or rodents. Others obviously are on deer, and they're going to climb up higher to encounter their preferred host. So there's unfortunately a variety of I don't think I can say, oh, there's a certain height that's safe. You're just going to potentially get a different life stage or encounter a different species. And yeah, they come, the mammals that they will use as hosts again are rodents, deer. So that's why one of the tips is trying to discourage rodent activity, moving wood piles away from where your house is or where people are recreating or playing. And then also, one potential solution that I have read is, trying to exclude deer from your yard as well, even though I know that's easier said than done in many cases. But unfortunately, I think this is why, yeah, like you were saying, Sarah, do tick checks after you've been out there gardening and pulling plants, no matter what size the plant is, because unfortunately, they'll use vegetation of various heights to quest, depending on the situation.
There's another question here. It kind of gets back to natural enemy support, which I love that as a topic. So this particular question is whether having a bat box, so encouraging more bats in your vicinity, like will that help reduce mosquitoes and or ticks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And from everything I've looked at, there's really no evidence, unfortunately, that birds or bats really have any significant impact on the population of adult mosquitoes in your yards. There are plenty of studies that show that, these creatures do eat mosquitoes, but unfortunately there's so many of them and they are so small, so they have to eat so many of them to, get the nutrients they need, that they tend to be more of a kind of a supplemental part of their diet, not, the main thing that these birds and bats are eating. So while they do eat mosquitoes, they're not going to be, doing it at a quantity that's going to significantly impact it. But I would never discourage you from putting up a bat house. It's great to encourage biodiversity. And again, it's not going to, it can only help. It's not going to hurt, but I doubt that you're going to install a bat box and then suddenly, see a really marked decrease in mosquito populations.
You might get to enjoy seeing more bats swooping around.
Yeah.
Let's see, there were a couple people asking about specific products, and I don't know whether you have information about. I know you said a lot of this proprietary.
I
but
don't have information on specific products off the top of my head, but again, if anybody who's asking those questions wants to send me an email at my email that's up on the screen, I'm happy to look into it for you and kind of see what the active ingredients are. And yeah.
Thanks. I'll just call out particularly, I want them not to know I'm not ignoring them. So that was Progea, so it's one of these organic ones, and then there was another one called Insect Z Shield or Insect
Okay.
Shield. So
yeah.
people are trying to do the right thing by having something less toxic, but they're now wondering what's actually in this and how effective is it. Thanks for.
I just saw the comment about ticks using a lint roller. That sounds kind of interesting.
So I've walked through a tick fall in Costa Rica where I had literally hundreds of newly emerged ticks on my leg, and I don't know if it would be as effective on your skin, but on your pant leg, we use masking tape to catch literally hundreds of ticks that were all over me. So that is very effective. I don't know if a lint roller adhesive is as strong as masking tape, but probably easier to have large volumes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't recommend the experience.
Yeah. I mean, not ticks isn't cool, but
yeah. One other thing I just want to share with everyone who's listening before people disappear is in the fall we had a talk with Sarah Evans in New York about the impacts of different chemical toxicities on your family, your children, and your yards, and she had ideas on how to talk with your neighbors too collaboratively, like she how to manage your yard less intensively. She was talking about more herbicides, I think, too, but insecticides as well. So we have a recording of her talk and some resources she shared on our past events page on the Lexington Living Landscapes website, along with all of our other talks. And this talk will end up there too, so anyone can find it. But you may find that we have a couple other related talks that help you think about what you do or don't want to be applying at home.
That sounds great.
Thanks. I'm sure that I have missed some questions. You all, thank you, audience, you have asked such a bunch of varied and very interesting questions. So I'm scrolling through to see if there are any totally different topics that I maybe have missed. I think I got most of them, but my apologies if I didn't. But anyway, so I'll leave it at that. Please do reach out to Erin. If I did miss your question, my apologies. So thanks again to our audience. Thank you so much, Erin, both for your presentation, which was very thoughtful and far-reaching and detailed at the same time. And really appreciate the time you have spent with us and your willingness to field this wide variety of questions as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you everybody for all of the questions.
And with that, I'll say, hey, Matt, thanks for facilitating everything for us.
Thank you for doing all the heavy lifting, both of you. Thank you, everyone.